Alice looked at an old photo of Chloe and Mark when they were little, smiling. How long had it been since she'd had a family trip? She carefully placed the photo into her only handbag, her heart full of happiness. She had sacrificed her entire life for them, and today, she believed it was time to be repaid. But she was wrong. She didn't know that her unconditional love was about to be discarded literally. The car stopped in a desolate place that reeked of a foul odor. "Get out," Chloe ordered coldly from the front seat. "You're in our way, Mom." Before Alice could understand what was happening, Mark had already dragged her out and thrown her handbag on the ground. "Don't," Alice begged. But the car door slammed shut. She watched in horror as the car sped away, leaving her behind in the middle of the trash. She had been abandoned by the very children she loved. If you are listening from anywhere in the world, leave a comment and subscribe, because some truths need to be spread, even if they shake your beliefs. Some stories, no matter how painful, must be told. The cold of the night took hold of her body. Without food, without shelter, surrounded by threatening shadows, her only companions were her tears and the echo of her broken heart. Why had they done this to her? What had she done to deserve so much pain? But what Alice didn't know was that fate had not yet written its final chapter. An unexpected surprise would change her life forever. What a joy to have wonderful people like you watching this video. We receive viewers from all over the world, and I would love to know where you are watching from now. Leave me a comment, give me a like, and subscribe for more exciting stories. The morning sun filtered gently through the window of Alice's house, illuminating her serene face as she finished packing some clothes into a small suitcase. Her heart beat with excitement as her children, Chloe and Mark, had invited her on a family trip after so many years of distance. As she packed an old knitted sweater, her own hands, she nostalgically remembered the days when her children were little, running through the house asking her for stories before bed. She wondered at what moment everything had changed. When had the unconditional love she gave them turned into indifference? But she didn't want to think about that now. This was an opportunity to make up for lost time, to show them that she was still there for them. She looked in the mirror, smoothed her gray hair with her fingers, and smiled. Maybe after this trip, things would be different. Mark's black sedan was waiting in front of the house, with Chloe sitting in the passenger seat, wearing dark sunglasses that hid her expression. Alice got into the back seat with a grateful smile, saying she was happy to spend time with them. Mark responded in a neutral tone that they were also happy she could travel. Chloe just nodded without looking at her, fixing her eyes on her phone. Alice felt a pang in her chest, but decided to ignore it. She focused on watching the landscape pass by the window, enjoying the movement of the car and the warm breeze coming through a crack. For a moment, she felt it was a normal day, a good day, but it didn't take long to notice that the road was becoming increasingly desolate. She looked around and asked with curiosity where they were going. Mark replied curtly that they were taking a shortcut. Alice frowned. She had never been on these roads, and the trees on the sides seemed increasingly dense, as if hiding a disturbing secret. The car stopped abruptly in a desolate area, with mounds of trash piled in the distance and a nauseating smell permeating the air. Alice felt a chill run down her spine. She asked in a low voice why they had stopped. But instead of an answer, she saw Chloe get out of the car without even looking at her. Mark turned in his seat and told her in a tense voice to get out of the car. His tone allowed no argument. Alice's confusion turned to fear when she saw her son's face, hardened with a coldness she had never seen in him before. She refused to move, muttering that she didn't understand what was happening. Mark sighed impatiently and yanked open the back door, grabbing her arm roughly. The contact chilled Alice's blood. Chloe, still standing by the car, crossed her arms and looked at her mother with an expression that mixed contempt and annoyance. Alice felt her heart race as Mark pulled her out of the car by force, pushing her onto the dusty ground. Her knees hit the dirt with sharp pain, but the anguish in her soul was much worse than any physical wound. She clung to Mark's leg desperately, her voice trembling, begging them not to leave her there. She asked what she had done wrong, why her own children were treating her this way. Why were they abandoning her as if she were nothing? Her tears fell uncontrollably, her body shaken by heartbreaking sobs. Mark pulled away abruptly, as if her touch repulsed him, and said with unbearable coldness that it was better this way, that she was just a burden, that they were tired of having to worry about her. Chloe, with a grimace of impatience, added in a cutting voice that they had no other choice and that she had to accept her fate. The sound of the car door closing resonated like thunder in Alice's mind. She watched in terror as her children got back into the vehicle without even giving her a final glance. She tried to stand, stumbling, and ran a few steps after the accelerating car, holding out a trembling hand, screaming with all the air left in her lungs, begging them to stop. But the car sped up, kicking up dust and leaving behind an echo of absolute abandonment. The silence that followed was unbearable. Alice stood for a few seconds, paralyzed, staring at the empty road in disbelief, hoping that at any moment her children would return and say it was all a cruel joke. But the minutes passed, and the only response was the cold wind and the distant hum of insects hidden in the trash. Her legs gave out, and she fell to her knees again, feeling her soul break into 1,000 pieces. The smell of decay filled her lungs. The thick air made it hard to breathe. She looked around desperately, seeing rats digging through the waste, flies buzzing over decomposing food scraps. A shiver ran through her body as she realized that this filthy place was now her home, that she had nowhere to go, that she had been discarded as if her life had no value. The tears kept falling, staining her aged, dirty face with traces of pain and hopelessness. The sun began to set, and the shadow of night loomed over her like a nightmarish shroud. She had new coat, new food, new hopey. She trembled, not just from the cold, but from the terror of what awaited her in this hell. She remembered every moment she had sacrificed everything for her children. Every sleepless night caring for them when they were small, every meal she skipped so they would have enough. She remembered their childhood laughter, their tender hugs when they were still innocent, when they loved her unconditionally. How was it possible they had changed so much? At what point had her love turned to contempt? Her mind found no answers, only an unbearable emptiness that made her feel as if she no longer existed. Hunger began to tighten in her stomach, but more than hunger for food, she felt a hunger for love, a desperate desire to understand why she had been treated this way. Her hands clutched her chest as if she could hold the broken pieces of her heart together. She closed her eyes tightly, wishing to disappear, wishing it were all a bad dream from which she would wake up in her bed, with her children still small, laughing and running through the house. But when she opened them, the darkness was still there, the trash was still around her, and the cold was still seeping into her bones. The world had forgotten her. She hugged herself, trembling, with the sole company of her own sadness. The night fell over the dump like a shroud of despair, enveloping Alice in a thick, oppressive darkness. The cold pierced her bones like invisible needles. Every blast of icy wind brought the stench of decomposing trash, and her empty stomach growled with a fury that made her double over. Her body trembled with hunger and fear, but the worst was the feeling of abandonment that burned her soul. Her own children had left her there, discarded like a useless object, without even a glance of compassion. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to conserve some warmth, but she knew she couldn't stay still all night. She had to find something, anything, to help her survive. Her eyes scanned the grotesque landscape around her. Mountains of waste rose like dark ghosts under the faint moonlight. With superhuman effort, she stood up and began to walk among the debris, her legs numb and her heart beating with an erratic rhythm. There was no other choice. She had to find something to eat, even if it was the last thing she did. Her trembling hands sifted through broken plastic bags, damp cardboard, and mold-covered food scraps. Every time she found something that seemed minimally edible, disgust closed her throat, but hunger was stronger than her dignity. She brought a piece of hard bread to her mouth, feeling her tongue scrape against the dry, hardened texture. The taste was repulsive, but her body received it as a momentary balm. She chewed slowly, forcing herself to swallow, her eyes filled with tears of humiliation. She wondered how she had reached this point. How could it be that after dedicating her entire life to her children, she was now here, rummaging through the trash like a stray animal? The answer didn't come. Only the echo of her ragged breath and the sound of rats moving through the waste. She covered her mouth to keep from screaming, to not lose herself in the abyss of her own despair. Every second in that place was a punishment, a silent torture that tore her apart from the inside. Suddenly, she heard footsteps approaching on the nearby road. Her heart pounded. Hope lit up in her eyes for an instant, but when she looked toward the source of the sound, all she saw were shadows of people passing by without even turning their heads in her direction. A man in a thick coat crossed the street, glancing at her sideways, and quickened his pace as if her mere presence was a threat. A young woman walking with a shopping bag saw her, frowned, and averted her gaze with disdain. No one stopped. No one asked if she needed help. To them, she was invisible, just another one of the countless homeless people society preferred to ignore. She felt her dignity shatter with every scornful look, with every gesture of indifference. She hugged her knees, hiding her face in her arms, wishing to disappear, wishing to be swallowed by the earth rather than continue feeling so insignificant. Never in her life had she experienced such deep pain, such devastating loneliness. If death claimed her at that moment, she would not resist. The distant sound of shrill laughter snapped her out of her thoughts. She looked around fearfully, noticing that the night brought dangers even darker than hunger and indifference. Shadows moved among the mounds of trash, human figures that didn't seem to have good intentions. She heard the echo of male voices arguing in the distance, the crash of bottles breaking against the ground, the muffled laughter of someone who sounded drunk. Her skin prickled with fear. She knew that in a place like this, being a woman alone and vulnerable was a death sentence. She hurried to find a corner to hide, a space where she could go unnoticed until morning. Her legs barely responded, but terror gave her enough strength to move. She huddled between two large metal dumpsters, hiding her body with dirty cardboard, praying silently that no one would find her. She closed her eyes tightly, her breathing shallow, her heart pounding like a drum inside her chest. To be discarded like trash is one thing, but to be hunted in the darkness, you can just feel her terror. Alice has hit rock bottom, but the morning light is about to bring the most unexpected twist. Stay with me to see who arrives. The sounds of the night were relentless. She heard the movement of rats lurking near her feet, the hoot of an owl in the distance, the engine of a car passing without stopping. Every noise made her flinch, kept her alert, trapped between panic and extreme fatigue. Time moved with unbearable slowness. Silent tears streamed down her face. Her mind invoked memories of her home, the smell of coffee in the mornings, the soft touch of the blankets on her bed, the laughter of her children when they were small. How could they have done this to her? How was it possible that the love she had given them had turned into such cruel abandonment? She bit her lips to keep from sobbing. She couldn't afford to make noise. She couldn't draw attention. She just had to hold on until the sun came up. The first glimmers of dawn painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. The cold of the night began to dissipate slowly, but the weight of exhaustion in her body was still unbearable. Alice moved cautiously, feeling her muscles numb, her body stiff from lack of sleep and accumulated tension. She sat up with difficulty, feeling the sticky grime on her skin, the stench of trash embedded in her clothes. She wondered how much more she could endure, if her fragile body would withstand another day in this hell. Her eyes lifted to the empty road, and at that moment, a sound broke the morning silence. A car engine. But not just any car. It wasn't like the dilapidated vehicles that used to pass by without stopping. It was a powerful, smooth sound, the purr of a well-maintained engine, of a car that didn't belong in this place. She turned slowly and saw a sleek black car stop a few feet from where she was. Her hands trembled. Who would come to a place like this? Was it another person who would look at her with disgust and keep going? Or perhaps, for the first time since her abandonment, fate was offering her a chance to escape this hell? The car remained motionless for a few seconds that felt eternal. The door opened slowly, and a man of imposing stature got out with deliberate movements. His eyes scanned the place until they rested on Alice. He didn't have the look of contempt she had seen in so many others. He didn't have the gesture of feigned pity that hurt her so much. It was a different look, a look that truly saw her, that recognized her as more than just a shadow among the trash. Alice felt a lump form in her throat. Her heart beat hard, a mixture of fear and hope. She didn't know who this man was, or what his intentions were, but for the first time since her abandonment, she felt that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely alone. The engine sound still rumbled in the air, as Alice remained motionless, her body numb, and her mind clouded by the mix of fear and hope that gripped her. The man who got out of the car had an imposing presence, but not a threatening one. His walk was measured, his gestures controlled, and his dark, penetrating eyes settled on her with an expression she hadn't seen in a long time: sincere compassion. It wasn't the look of contempt she'd received from passers-by the night before, nor the cruel indifference her children had shown her. There was something about him that made her tremble, a strange sensation that whispered in her ear that maybe, just maybe, her fate wasn't completely sealed in this hell of waste and oblivion. She hugged her fragile body with her arms, trying to cover herself as if her misery could be hidden. But the man didn't look away. He didn't seem fazed by her condition. He just stood there, watching her with genuine interest, without rush, without disgust. Alice swallowed hard, feeling her heart pound against her chest, unable to guess what this stranger wanted from her. Robert took a few steps closer, shortening the distance between them, and in a calm voice told her he couldn't leave her there, that no one deserved to be in a place like this. Alice felt her knees buckle. She had been steeped in abandonment for so long that hearing someone tell her she still had value felt almost unreal. Her lips trembled. She tried to speak, but her throat only emitted a choked sob. Her eyes filled with tears, and Robert, without taking his eyes off her, extended a firm hand, inviting her to stand up. It wasn't an order, not a gesture of pity. It was an invitation, an opportunity. Alice hesitated. She looked at her own dirty clothes, her hands covered in grime, and shook her head in shame. She murmured in a thin voice that she couldn't get into a car like that she was dirty, that she didn't want to stain anything. Robert smiled slightly and told her that it didn't matter, that material things could be cleaned, but what was truly valuable was her. The warmth in his voice, the confidence with which he spoke, made her hesitate. Could she trust him? Could she allow herself to believe that someone wanted to help her without expecting anything in return? She looked at the outstretched hand for a long moment, her trembling fingers clutching her chest, and finally, with a shaky breath, she decided to accept. She took his hand shyly, and Robert helped her up carefully, as if she were made of glass. The inside of the car was a completely different world from the one she had inhabited for the past few days. The scent of leather, the warm temperature, the softness of the seat beneath her battered skin, it was all a clash of realities that made her momentarily dizzy. She sat still, not daring to move much, holding her breath, her hands on her lap, as if afraid to touch anything for fear of breaking it. Robert, from the driver's seat, watched her in the rearview mirror and told her gently to relax, that she was safe now. Alice closed her eyes for a moment, trying to process those words. Was she really safe? Or was this just a dream she would wake up from at any moment? But the car began to move, leaving the dump behind, and with every yard traveled, the feeling that her nightmare was being left behind became more real. The journey was silent at first. Robert didn't ask questions, didn't press her to talk. He just drove calmly, respecting her time, letting her get used to the idea that she was no longer in that place of death and despair. Alice looked out the window with teary eyes, watching the world she no longer thought she belonged to. People walked on the sidewalks, children ran in the parks, shops opened their doors as if nothing had changed, as if her suffering had never existed. She wondered how many people in that city were going through the same hell she had just escaped. How many others had been discarded without anyone offering them a hand. A sob escaped her lips, and Robert, noticing her distress, told her in a calm voice that soon everything would be better. When the car stopped in front of a huge, classic-style mansion in Alpine, Alice felt her heart race again. She couldn't believe someone like her was setting foot in a place like this. Robert opened the door for her and gestured kindly for her to follow him. Her legs trembled as she walked on the flawless marble of the entryway. The inside of the house was warm, inviting, with dim lights that contrasted with the cold of the previous night. But what really made her break down was what she saw in the dining room. A long table was set with the most exquisite dishes she had ever seen in her life. Freshly baked bread, fresh fruits, juicy, steaming roast beef, a pitcher of crystal-clear water shining under the light of the chandelier. Her stomach roared loudly, but what made her cry wasn't the food, but the idea that someone had prepared it for her, Robert, noticing her reaction, told her tenderly to eat without worrying, that she shouldn't be ashamed of being hungry. Alice covered her face with her hands, sobbing, unable to remember the last time she had eaten something that wasn't rotten or dirty. After several minutes of trying to calm down, she sat at the table and began to eat slowly, savoring every bite as if it were a miracle. Robert watched her in silence, not rushing her, not asking unnecessary questions. When she finally felt she could speak, Alice looked up, still with tears in her eyes, and thanked him in a broken voice. Robert, with a serene expression, told her he wanted to help her recover, that she shouldn't be afraid. She swallowed, and with a heavy heart, began to tell him everything. She told him about her children, the love she gave them, the betrayal she never saw coming, the pain of feeling abandoned by those she loved most. Her voice broke with every word, reliving the horror of her fall into misery. Robert listened without interrupting, his gaze full of empathy. When she finished, he told her firmly that no one with such a noble soul deserved to have gone through that he couldn't change the past, but he could offer her a new beginning. Alice felt her tears well up again, but this time they weren't just tears of pain, but of relief, of hope. For the first time in a long time, she felt that maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over yet. The hot water slid over her skin like a balm, washing away not only the accumulated grime from the days of misery, but also a part of the weight she carried in her soul. Alice closed her eyes and let the steam envelop her, feeling every muscle in her body relax after being subjected to the relentless cold and the pain of despair. Her trembling hands traced her own face, feeling the wrinkles that marked her history, the skin weathered by the years and the tears she had shed in silence. It was the first time in so long that she could remember the feeling of being human again, the first time her body wasn't trembling from hunger or fear. The bath wasn't just cleaning her body, it was somehow washing away the shadow of abandonment, at least for that moment. She clung to that feeling, as if afraid that when she got out of the water, everything would go back to how it was, that it was all a mirage. But when she wrapped herself in the soft white towel Robert had left for her on the marble countertop, she understood this was not a dream. She looked at herself in the fogged mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. Her eyes were still swollen from so much crying, but there was something different in her reflection, something she hadn't seen in a long time, a glimmer of hope. When she left the bathroom, she found a lightweight dress and new slippers on the bed, carefully placed as if someone had thought of every detail. Her fingers traced the fabric softly, surprised that someone had taken the time to think of her comfort. She dressed slowly, enjoying every small luxury she had once taken for granted. When she was ready, she left the room and found Robert waiting for her in the grand living room of the house, holding a cup of tea and wearing a calm expression. He looked at her and said she looked much better, that the color had returned to her cheeks. Alice looked down shyly and thanked him in a low voice, still feeling overwhelmed by so much kindness. Robert smiled and gestured for her to sit next to him. He served her a hot cup of tea and told her she should get used to being cared for, that all her life she had given without asking for anything in return, and it was time someone did something for her. Alice felt a lump in her throat, unable to remember the last time someone had genuinely cared about her well-being. She held the cup in her hands, letting the warmth seep through her fingers, and whispered that she didn't know how to thank him for everything he was doing. Robert looked at her seriously and told her she didn't have to thank him for anything, that sometimes life puts people on the right path at the exact right moment. As the days passed, Alice began to get used to the new reality Robert offered her. She no longer woke up with the cold, chilling her bones, or an empty stomach. Now she had a safe roof over her head, hot food every day, and most importantly, someone who treated her with respect and dignity. However, inside her, the wound of abandonment was still open. She didn't harbor hatred for her children. She couldn't even wish them ill. She only felt a deep sadness, a melancholy that accompanied her even in her calmest moments. Robert noticed. He saw the way her eyes would stare into the distance when she thought about her past. And one day, he told her she had the right to feel pain, but she shouldn't let that pain define her. She smiled bitterly and replied that she didn't know how to do that every memory trapped her like a ghost she couldn't escape. Robert leaned slightly toward her and said that maybe it wasn't about escaping, but about learning to live with the scars without letting them prevent her happiness. His words resonated with Alice in a way she hadn't expected. For the first time, she considered the possibility that she could still have a future, that she could still find a reason to keep going. Robert watched her with growing admiration. It wasn't just her strength that impressed him, but the way, despite everything she had suffered, she still retained her kind essence. There was no bitterness in her, no thirst for revenge, only a pure and sincere sadness. She was a woman who had been destroyed by those who should have loved her, and yet she still retained the ability to see the beauty in small details, to be grateful for every kind gesture. Robert had met many people in his life, but none like her. In the evenings, when they talked by the fireplace, he listened to her attentively, fascinated by the sweetness of her voice, by the way she spoke of life with humility, even after being trampled on. He couldn't help but think that the world wasn't fair to people like her. And slowly, without realizing it, he began to feel something more than admiration. Alice also noticed the way Robert looked at her, the patience with which he listened, the tenderness hidden in his gestures. Never before had a man treated her with such respect, with such consideration. It wasn't a look of compassion or pity. It was something different, something that made her feel alive again. On one of those quiet nights, as Robert handed her a blanket to cover herself from the cold, their fingers brushed briefly. It was a fleeting, almost accidental contact, but Alice felt a shiver run down her spine. Robert noticed her reaction and watched her in silence, as if he wanted to say something but was holding back. Alice looked away, feeling like a young girl discovering an unknown feeling for the first time. She didn't know what was growing between them, but she couldn't deny that every day her heart beat faster in his presence. Over time, the small gestures between them became more frequent. Robert found excuses to sit closer to her during dinners, to touch her hand when he offered her a cup of tea, to give her smiles that only she could see. Alice, unintentionally, began to look forward to those moments, to feel a special warmth whenever he was near. One night, while they were watching the rain fall through the window, Robert told her that he had never met a woman like her, that her strength and nobility were a treasure few people possessed. Alice felt her heart race, but instead of replying, she just rested her head on the back of the armchair and closed her eyes, allowing herself, for the first time in a long time, to dream of the possibility of a new beginning. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, and in that time, Alice and Robert built something neither of them had expected to find at this stage of their lives. At first, it was just companionship, a friendship that blossomed during long nights of conversation by the fireplace, quiet walks through the mansion's gardens, and shared small routines, like the tea Robert prepared every afternoon, or the way Alice made sure he didn't forget his coat on cold days. But slowly, without either of them being able to stop it, something more began to grow between them. Robert noticed how his heart beat faster every time he saw her smile, how her presence filled the house, which had previously seemed too large and empty, with warmth. Alice, for her part, was surprised to find herself eagerly awaiting every shared moment, feeling a genuine happiness in the simplicity of being by his side. It wasn't an impulsive or dramatic love, but a feeling born of admiration, respect, and the certainty that together they had found something life owed them for a long time. One afternoon, while walking along the beach at the shore, with the sound of the waves breaking gently on the sand and the fresh wind tangling in their hair, Robert suddenly stopped and took Alice's hands in his. His eyes, usually so confident and calm, reflected a deep emotion she couldn't quite interpret at first. He told her that never in his life had he met a woman like her, that her strength, kindness, and dignity were something that had changed him forever. He confessed that he had spent years surrounded by luxury, by people interested in his money, by empty friendships and superficial relationships, but with her, he had found something real, something that gave meaning to his existence. Alice felt her heart accelerate as he continued, saying he didn't want to imagine his future without her, that life had given him a second chance, and he didn't plan on wasting it. Then, with a deep sigh, Robert asked her to marry him, to share whatever path they had left together. From rock bottom to this beautiful moment on the beach, Alice deserves this happiness more than anyone. It feels like the perfect ending, doesn't it? But as we know, fate always has another card to play. Alice stood in silence, her eyes filling with tears. Not because she doubted her answer, but because she had never imagined that fate would give her a chance to be happy again. With a trembling voice, she said yes, that she wanted to be by his side, that he had been her salvation in the darkest moments, and now she wanted to be his companion in the light. The months that followed were the happiest of their lives. They traveled together to places Alice had never imagined seeing, explored breathtaking landscapes, laughed until they cried at shared anecdotes, and discovered in every small detail the beauty of having each other. They weren't a young couple. They didn't have the impulsiveness of youth or the urgency of those who feel they must rush to live, but that allowed them to enjoy every moment with a calm and fulfillment that few knew. Robert told her he had never felt such peace, that with her by his side, every day was a gift. Alice, in turn, felt that for the first time in a long time, she belonged somewhere, that she had found a home in the arms of someone who valued her, not for what she could give, but for who she was. They got used to waking up together, with the dawn light streaming through the windows, sharing comfortable silences, supporting each other in moments when the melancholy of the past tried to catch up. It was a love without rush, deep and serene, like two souls who had waited too long to find each other. But happiness is never eternal, and fate, once again, decided to test them. It all started with an unusual tiredness in Robert, with minor discomforts he insisted on ignoring, with nights when he woke up breathless, with days when the color seemed to fade from his skin. Alice was the first to notice something was wrong, to insist he see a doctor, to not let him downplay what was happening. Robert, with his usual calm, told her not to worry, that it was just fatigue, that it would pass. But it didn't pass. On the contrary, it got worse. When he finally agreed to get tests, the truth fell on them like a devastating blow. Robert was sick. His body was being consumed by a terminal illness, and the doctors were clear in their diagnosis. There was no cure, there wasn't much time. Alice felt the floor open up beneath her feet, that everything they had built together was about to collapse in the cruelest way possible. Robert, however, looked at her with eyes full of love and told her he didn't want her to cry for him, that every moment they had left should be lived with gratitude, that life had given them a gift, and they should cherish it until the very last second. Alice became his unwavering support. She cared for him with absolute dedication, not letting fear paralyze her, not allowing sadness to steal the days they could still share. Robert, despite his weakening, strove to keep his spirit intact, to remain the man she had loved from the first day. They spent the afternoons holding hands in the garden, talking about everything and nothing, remembering the happy moments, clinging to the beauty of what they had experienced. But Alice knew that time was a silent enemy, advancing relentlessly. Every night when he slept, she stayed awake, watching his breathing, memorizing every feature of his face, every line time had drawn on his skin. She couldn't imagine life without him, but she knew she had to be strong, because that's what Robert would have wanted. One night, when the illness had consumed almost all his strength, Robert took Alice's hand with what little energy he had left and told her he had made a decision. In a weak but firm voice, he told her he wanted his entire fortune to be left in her hands, that he trusted she would know what to do with it. That money had never meant anything to him until he met her, because only with her did he understand that true wealth wasn't in material things, but in love and kindness. He asked her to use those resources to do good, to help those who, like her, had been abandoned, to change lives just as his life had changed hers. Alice, heartbroken, could do nothing but nod, tears streaming down her face, a pain in her chest that made her feel like she was breaking apart inside. Robert gave her one last smile, a look full of love, and with a whisper, told her she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. And so, in the middle of the night, his hand still intertwined with Alice's, Robert closed his eyes for the last time, leaving behind an eternal love that not even death could erase. Her heart is breaking all over again. She found the only man who truly saw her, only to lose him. But Robert didn't just leave her a fortune. He left her a mission. Let's see what Alice does with this new purpose. The room was completely silent, broken only by the sound of the wind gently tapping the windows and by Alice's ragged breathing as she still held Robert's hand, feeling the warmth slowly fade from his skin. His body was still, his expression serene, as if he were merely asleep, as if at any moment he would open his eyes and give her one last smile. But Alice knew that wouldn't happen, that life had slipped away from him in a breath, taking with it everything she had learned to love again. She felt her chest tighten, the world closing in around her in a spiral of indescribable pain. She didn't cry right away. She couldn't. The emptiness was too vast, too absolute. She stayed there, her gaze fixed on his face, memorizing every line, every trace of the person who had changed her destiny, who had rescued her from the abyss and given her a reason to live when she thought she had nothing left. She leaned down slowly and rested her forehead on his chest, feeling its last warmth, and in that instant, reality hit her with devastating force. A choked sob escaped her lips, followed by a deep, silent cry, a cry not just for the loss, but for the certainty that nothing would ever be the same. The following days were a whirlwind of paperwork, farewells, and a grief that seemed to consume everything. The mansion, once full of life, became cold and empty. The rooms that once echoed with shared conversations and laughter were now just witnesses to an absence that weighed like an endless shadow. But in the midst of her pain, Alice understood that Robert had left her more than a fortune. He had left her a purpose. She remembered his last words, the request he made with a broken voice, the desire for her to use his wealth to do good, to change lives, to help those who, like her, had been forgotten. She realized she couldn't let herself fall into sadness, that her love for him had to be manifested in actions, that his legacy couldn't be limited to an inheritance on paper and in bank accounts, but to something much greater. She stood up with determination, dried her tears, and decided she would not waste the gift he had left her. For months, Alice dedicated herself to transforming her pain into something tangible. With the fortune Robert had left her, she began investing in homes for abandoned seniors, in institutions dedicated to caring for those who had been discarded by their own families, those who, like her, had once been condemned to live in oblivion. She toured hospitals, visited shelters, shook trembling hands, and listened to stories of lives that had been relegated to indifference. She saw in the eyes of these seniors the same suffering that had once consumed her, and with every smile she managed to bring back, she felt her mission gain more meaning. She didn't become just a distant benefactor, but an active presence, a woman who gave not only money but time, love, and compassion. Her name began to resonate in charity circles, in the media, in the hearts of those she had saved. She was no longer the broken woman abandoned at a dump. She was now Alice, a powerful woman, not because of the money she possessed, but because of the strength that moved her to do good. But the past always finds a way to return, and hers did in the most unexpected way. One morning, while glancing at the star ledger in her study, her gaze stopped on a story that left her breathless. It was a report on the financial crisis that had hit many families in the area, about people who had lost everything due to bad decisions and unbridled ambition. And among the images of anguished faces, she saw two people she never thought she would see that way again: Chloe and Mark, her children. The article reported that both had fallen into ruin after failed investments, that their businesses had collapsed, and that they were now desperate, trying to stay afloat amid a financial scandal that had left them with nothing. Alice felt a chill run down her spine. A mix of emotions washed over her. It wasn't joy, it wasn't revenge, it wasn't satisfaction. It was a weight in her chest, a reminder of the decision she had to make. Her children, the same ones who had abandoned her without remorse, were now in the same position they had left her in. Fate, with its cruel irony, had taught them a lesson without her lifting a finger. But what would she do now? She spent the night awake, the newspaper still on her desk, reading and rereading every word, observing the faces of Chloe and Mark, searching them for any trace of remorse. She wondered if they thought of her, if, upon losing everything, they remembered how they discarded her, as if she were worthless. She wondered if the fear they felt now was the same fear she felt that night at the dump, if their desperation resembled the desperation that consumed her when she realized she was completely alone. But as much as she tried to find hatred in her heart, she couldn't. She only felt compassion. Not because they were her children, but because she knew what it meant to fall into the abyss. She knew what it was to feel trapped, hopeless, with nowhere to turn. And then she understood what she had to do. With a firm decision, she rose from her chair and picked up the phone. She called her assistant and told her to begin preparations, that she needed to arrange a special meeting. Her voice didn't tremble. Her resolution was absolute. The time had come to return, to face her past, to look into the eyes of those who turned their backs on her and show them she was not the same woman they had abandoned. She wasn't doing it for revenge. She wasn't doing it to humiliate them. She was doing it because she knew there was a greater lesson she needed to impart, a lesson about love, about forgiveness, about what redemption truly means. Alice smiled slightly as she looked at her reflection in the mirror. The fragile, broken woman she once was no longer existed. Now she was strong, now she was powerful, and now she was the one who decided how this story would end. The night fell over the area with a golden glow that illuminated the Jersey City skyscrapers and tinged the streets with a faint, elegant, and distant reflection. At the top of the most exclusive hotel in the area, a private room was being prepared for an event that, for some, would be just another dinner, but for others, would mark an unexpected turn in their destinies. On the main table, crystal glasses gleamed under the warm light of the hanging lamps. The silver flatware was perfectly aligned, and an exquisite aroma of finely prepared dishes filled the air with a promise of luxury and refinement. Everything was calculated down to the last detail, from the fresh flowers arranged in centerpieces to the soft music that floated in the air. However, the real surprise had not yet arrived, and Alice, sitting at the head of the table in her perfectly tailored silk dress, waited patiently for the moment the past would call at her door. Across town, in a modest rented apartment, Chloe and Mark looked skeptically at the elegant invitation they had received hours earlier. A fine paper envelope with impeccable calligraphy summoning them to an exclusive dinner at a place they used to frequent naturally, before financial ruin sent them into disgrace. Mark turned the invitation over in his fingers, one eyebrow arched, wondering who would have summoned them with such insistence. Who had the power to remind them of what they had lost? Chloe, meanwhile, crossed her arms and muttered that she didn't understand why anyone would want to invite them, that they weren't part of that world anymore, that everything they had was gone, along with their reputation and their money. But curiosity was stronger than shame, stronger than the fear of facing someone who might be reveling in their misfortune. And so, with uncertainty marked on their faces, they both decided to attend, not knowing they were about to encounter the shadow they thought they had left behind forever. When they arrived at the hotel, they were received with the same courtesy as years ago, as if their fall meant nothing to those employees accustomed to dealing with the elite. They rode the elevator in silence to the top floor, holding their breath, their hands cold, never imagining that crossing the door of the grand ballroom would change their lives forever. The scene that unfolded before them left them breathless. At the main table, at the head, with the serene elegance of someone in complete control, sat their mother, Alice. Not the fragile, aged woman they left abandoned at a dump. Not the trembling shadow of their past, but an imposing woman with a firm gaze and a majestic bearing, dressed with the sophistication of someone who was now the master of her own destiny. The golden light of the chandeliers highlighted the glow of her skin, her hair gracefully pulled back, the subtle yet impressive jewelry adorning her hands. It wasn't a vision from the past. It was the image of a reborn woman, a woman who no longer belonged to the world of misery, but to the world they themselves had lost. This is the moment we've been waiting for. The look on their faces. They thought she was just a memory, and now she's standing there, holding all the power they lost. The tension is palpable. Let's listen to what she has to say. Mark felt his throat go dry. The weight of the shock left him speechless. His mother was alive. Chloe took a step back, her face pale, unable to comprehend what her eyes were seeing. She murmured in a low voice, as if she still couldn't accept reality. How is this possible? How could she be there? How had she survived? But Alice didn't answer immediately. She just watched them in silence, letting every second weigh on their consciences like a relentless hammer. Her gaze wasn't one of hatred or revenge, but it wasn't one of compassion either. It was a look of wisdom, of someone who understood all too well the fragility of life and the cruelty of those who should have loved her. The silence in the room became unbearable. Mark tried to find his voice and hurried to say that they didn't know what had happened to her, that they thought she was dead, that they never imagined something like this could happen. Chloe, with glassy eyes, desperately searched for a justification, saying that circumstances led them to make wrong decisions, that things weren't that simple, that at the time, they had no other choice. But Alice raised a hand elegantly, cutting off their words. She didn't need to hear excuses. She didn't want empty justifications. Her mere presence had already shown them that the time for lies was over. In a steady, firm voice, she told them that the past couldn't be changed, that what they did was marked on their souls, and that no words could erase it, that she had lived. She told them about the night they abandoned her, about the despair, the cold, the hunger, the loneliness that consumed her while they continued with their lives without looking back. She told them about the fear that kept her awake, the indifferent faces that saw her as just another shadow among the debris, the feeling of being invisible in a world that doesn't forgive the forgotten. Mark lowered his gaze, his breathing heavy, unable to bear the truth. Chloe covered her face with her hands, her body trembling, but Alice didn't stop. She continued, telling them that fate had led her to find someone who not only rescued her, but taught her that a person's value doesn't lie in what others think of them, but in what they carry inside. She told them about Robert, about his love, his generosity, the new life she built with him. And then, in a serene but relentless tone, she revealed that he had left her his fortune, that she now held more power in her hands than they ever imagined. Silence fell on the room again. But this time, it wasn't just surprise on Chloe and Mark's faces. It was the weight of guilt, the certainty that the woman they despised, whom they discarded as a burden, was now in a position they could never reach again. Mark opened his mouth to speak, to try to say something that might redeem him, but Alice looked at him with a mixture of sadness and determination and told him there were no words that could change the past, no apology that could erase the pain they caused her. Chloe sobbed quietly, murmuring that they never wanted to hurt her, that they were only thinking of themselves, that they had been selfish. Alice nodded slowly and replied that at least now they understood. Then, with an elegant gesture, she rose from her seat and approached them, observing the faces of those who were once her reason for living and were now just shadows of her past. She took a deep breath, with the calm of someone in absolute control, and told them they hadn't heard the most important part yet. Because tonight wasn't just about remembering the past, it was about deciding the future, and what she had prepared for them was something they would never forget. The silence in the grand ballroom was deafening. Chloe and Mark's breathing became increasingly erratic, as if their bodies couldn't bear the weight of what they had just heard. Their minds tried to process Alice's words, but the truth was too brutal to be easily digested. Across from them, their mother stood tall, her back straight, her gaze unwavering, the image of a woman who had walked through hell and returned with a power they never imagined. Mark felt his throat tighten. His sweaty hands trembled so much he had to lean on the table to keep from falling. Chloe, her face pale, her eyes red from unshed tears, murmured between sobs that she couldn't believe what she was hearing, that they never thought their mother had gone through anything like that. Alice tilted her head slightly and told them that, of course, they hadn't thought of anything but themselves when they abandoned her. That they never wondered if she would be okay, if she would survive, or if her life would become a living hell. Mark tried to speak, but his voice broke before he could find the right words. Chloe buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with anguish, as she whispered that they never wanted to hurt her so much, that they only thought of their own needs and believed she would find a way to get by. Alice watched them with the coldness of someone no longer manipulated by empty words and replied that she hadn't found a way to get by, that she had been on the verge of death, that she had felt hunger consume her body, that she had slept on trash fearing she would never wake up, that she had been invisible to the world until someone with a kind heart extended the hand that they, her own children, had denied her. Chloe stood up abruptly, her body trembling, her eyes full of desperate tears, and said in a pleading tone that she was sorry, that if she could go back, she would change everything, that she would never forgive herself for what they had done. Mark, unable to meet his mother's gaze, muttered that he was willing to do whatever it took to prove they weren't the same people they were before, that they had changed, that life had taught them a cruel lesson, and that they were paying for their mistakes every day. Alice let them talk, let them fall apart in front of her, let them face the weight of their own guilt. She wasn't being cruel. She felt no pleasure in seeing them in this state, but she also couldn't ignore the fact that if she hadn't found Robert, if luck hadn't saved her, she wouldn't have been there, alive and strong, to see them fall. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and then told them she wasn't there to destroy them. That if she had wanted revenge, she would have already taken it. That she had the power and resources to make them disappear from society if she wished. Mark tensed at those words, swallowing hard, aware that it was true, that his mother now had the influence to do whatever she wanted with them. Chloe, her face bathed in tears, sobbed that she didn't know what else they could do to show their remorse. Alice looked at them intensely and finally told them she hadn't come for revenge, but to teach them what true love was, the love they never understood. The love that isn't about convenience, but about sacrifice, dedication, and forgiveness. Mark felt his chest tighten upon hearing those words. His mother was there, in front of them, giving them a chance to redeem themselves when the most logical thing would have been for her to banish them from her life forever. Chloe, between sobs, asked if there was still a chance that one day she could consider them family again. Alice looked at her with a serene expression and said that it depended on them, that if they truly wanted to show they had changed, they would have to do it with actions, not words. Mark, his heart pounding against his chest, asked what she expected of them. Alice took a deep breath, her gaze becoming firmer, and in a calm but unbreakable voice, told them she would not give them money. She would not help them regain the status they lost. That if they wanted a second chance in her life, they would have to learn the meaning of humility, effort, and sacrifice. She informed them that she had founded several homes for abandoned seniors, and that if they truly wanted to redeem themselves, they would have to work in one of them, caring for people who had been forgotten by their families, just as they had forgotten her. Mark opened his mouth to protest, but Alice stopped him with a sharp look. She told them they would have no privileges, no special treatment. They would start from the bottom, cleaning, feeding, and accompanying those who needed it most. And only after they had proven with deeds that they understood the harm they had caused, then and only then, might she consider the possibility of opening the doors of her life to them again. This isn't revenge, it's poetic justice. She's not giving them money. She's giving them a chance to earn their humanity back by facing the very abandonment they inflicted. This is her ultimate test for them. The question is, will they show up? Chloe broke down crying, unable to process the magnitude of the challenge their mother was imposing. Mark clenched his fists, his pride wounded, but looking into Alice's eyes, he understood there was no alternative. Alice remained silent, giving them the time needed to absorb her decision. She knew it was the only way for them to truly learn, for them to feel firsthand what it meant to be discarded, ignored, relegated to nothing. She didn't want to see them suffer, but she also wouldn't let them simply apologize and continue with their lives as if nothing had happened. Chloe, in a broken voice, murmured that she would do whatever her mother asked, that if this was the only way to show her she was truly sorry, then she would do it. Mark, his face hardened but his gaze lowered, nodded in silence, accepting his fate. Alice watched them for a moment longer, and then took a step back. Her voice was soft but firm when she told them she expected to see them at the nursing home the next day, and if they didn't show up, she would understand that their words meant nothing. With that, she turned and walked toward the exit of the ballroom, with the elegance of someone no longer carrying the shadow of her past. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She knew the decision was in their hands, and that for the first time in their lives, they would have to learn the true meaning of love and redemption. The door closed behind her, leaving Chloe and Mark alone in the grand ballroom, facing the reality that the only person they had ever underestimated was now the only one who could save them from themselves. The first day at the nursing home was a silent humiliation for Chloe and Mark. When they arrived, they were met by the facility administrator, a woman with a serious face and an inquisitive gaze, who explained coldly that they were not special there, that their last names and their past didn't matter. They were there to work and prove they truly wanted to change. Chloe felt a lump in her throat when she saw the place, the worn walls, the hallways where the air smelled of medicine and disinfectant, the wheelchairs lined up next to the rooms of those who had no one waiting for them elsewhere. Mark, his jaw tight and his pride wounded, lowered his head when they handed him a simple uniform, khaki pants and a polo shirt, like any other volunteer. There were no luxuries, no privileges, no way to escape. Alice had been clear. Either they did the work, or she would disappear from their lives forever. With resignation, they put on the uniforms and followed the administrator, who assigned them tasks they had never imagined doing in their lives. Chloe was sent to the kitchen to help prepare meals, something she had never done in her house, where she always had staff to take care of every detail. Mark was assigned to clean the hallways and bathrooms, a task that made him clench his teeth in frustration, but he said nothing, knowing he had no right to complain. The first weeks were harsh and cold. Chloe had to get up before dawn to help prepare breakfast for the seniors, serve them patiently, collect the dishes, and clean the tables. She wasn't used to hearing stories of people abandoned by their families, to receiving empty stares from those who no longer expected anything from life. An elderly man with sad eyes asked her one day if his family would come to visit him, and she felt a weight in her chest when she had to lie to him so he wouldn't lose hope. Mark, meanwhile, discovered what it was to spend hours kneeling on the floor, scrubbing tiles, collecting dirty blankets, changing sheets that smelled of neglect. At first, they worked in silence, resentment still simmering in their hearts, feeling that this was all too cruel a test. But over time, something began to change. Chloe started to notice how the seniors looked at her with gratitude when she served their food with a smile, how some would take her hand tenderly, as if seeking in her touch a bit of the love they had been denied. Mark began to hear the stories of those who, like his mother, were forgotten by their children, those who gave everything and ended up alone, waiting in a corner of life for someone to remember them. One day, while helping an elderly man walk down the hall, Mark felt a lump in his throat when he heard the man's broken voice say that he had worked all his life to give his children the best, and still, they left him there without a goodbye, without an explanation, as if his existence no longer mattered. Mark felt his chest tighten, as if the man's words were a mirror reflecting his worst sin. He remembered the night they abandoned his mother, Alice's expression when she looked at them pleadingly, the way he sped up the car without looking back. He felt sick, dizzy, wanting to vomit, because in that moment he understood the damage they had caused not just to her, but to themselves. Chloe had her own moment of revelation when she saw an elderly woman crying at the window, waiting for her son to come visit a son who never arrived. Chloe approached her and promised her he would come soon, but the old woman shook her head and told her it wasn't true, that she knew he wouldn't return, that people like him only remembered their parents when it was too late. Chloe felt her legs tremble and had to hold on to the back of the chair to keep from falling. She saw herself reflected in that story. She saw her mother in that old woman. She saw her own heart, rotted by ambition and indifference. That night, when the home was quiet and everyone was asleep, Chloe and Mark met in the kitchen. They didn't speak at first, just looked at each other with the same expression of defeat. Mark was the first to break the silence, saying in a broken voice that for the first time in his life, he understood what they had done, that he had never felt so much shame. Chloe, her eyes full of tears, nodded and said she couldn't stop thinking about her mother, about everything she suffered, about how they could have been so cruel to the only person who had given them everything. Mark ran a hand over his face, exhaling a shaky breath, and said he didn't know if Alice would ever forgive them, but at least he wanted to try to be someone worthy of her love again. Chloe dried her tears with the sleeve of her uniform and replied that she felt the same, that it didn't matter how long it took, she would do whatever was necessary to show her mother they had truly changed. They spent months at the nursing home, working every day with more dedication. Not because it was an obligation imposed by Alice, but because they felt it in their hearts. They learned to listen, to care, to see the humanity in those they would have previously ignored. They stopped thinking about the money, the life they lost, the wealth they once had, because they finally understood that those things never meant anything compared to the love and dignity Alice had taught them. And then, one day, she returned. She entered the home with a calm step, dressed in her usual elegance, but with an expression of serenity on her face. Chloe and Mark saw her standing in the entrance and felt the world stop. Neither of them moved at first, fearful, uncertain, unsure if they truly deserved her presence. But then, Alice opened her arms in silence. And in that instant, all the pride, all the guilt, all the distance shattered. After everything she endured, this is true power. Not the money, but the strength to forgive. You can just feel the weight of all that pain finally lifting in this one embrace. But forgiveness is one thing. Building a future is another. Let's see how their story truly ends. Chloe ran to her first, followed by Mark, and the three of them embraced tightly, without saying a word, just feeling the warmth of a love that should never have been lost. They cried together, not from guilt, not from remorse, but from the certainty that despite everything, there was still hope. There was still a family. Alice held them firmly and whispered that true love doesn't hold grudges, that redemption isn't a right, but a gift earned with the soul. And in that moment, they understood that although they could never erase the past, they could still build a future. The morning dawned quiet, with a warm sun filtering through the curtains of the grand window in Alice's mansion. The breeze gently moved the leaves of the trees in the garden, and the aroma of fresh coffee filled the air with a comforting warmth. Sitting in her study, a pen in her hand and a pile of documents in front of her, Alice signed with determination every page that marked the fate of her fortune. There was no doubt in her eyes, no hesitation in her movements. She knew exactly what she had to do, what Robert would have wanted, what her own heart asked of her. For a long time, she had understood that money, though powerful, had no value if it didn't serve something greater than the mere accumulation of wealth. Her story, her pain, her rebirth, it had all been a lesson that now became her greatest legacy. She signed the last page with a deep sigh and leaned back in her chair, letting the reality of her decision settle in her soul. She had donated the majority of her fortune to the homes for abandoned seniors, to shelters where people who had been forgotten would find a dignified place to live, a place where they would never again feel the cold of contempt or the hunger of indifference. She didn't want anyone else to go through what she lived through. She didn't want any other mother, any other father, to feel discarded by those they gave life to. Across town, in the same home where they once felt the shame of their past, Chloe and Mark worked with the dedication of those who have found a purpose greater than themselves. Chloe helped the seniors get dressed every morning, delicately combing the white hair of the women who now looked at her with affection, as if they had found in her the daughter life had taken from them. Mark, his sleeves rolled up and his hands firm, pushed wheelchairs with the same patience with which he once only handled luxury cars. He had become a different man, someone who no longer measured his worth by the amount of money in his account, but by the gratitude in the eyes of those he helped. They no longer worked there out of obligation. It was no longer a test imposed by their mother. It was their choice, their way of redeeming themselves, their way of ensuring they would never again become the people they once were. The transformation hadn't been easy, but it had been genuine. They had learned that life is fragile, that mistakes are heavy, but that true repentance is only valid when translated into actions. And in every smile they saw at the end of the day, they felt they were doing the right thing. That night, for the first time in many years, the table was set for three. Alice's dining room, which for so long had been a place of silence and loneliness, now glowed with the warmth of a reunited family. The fine china shone under the dim light of the lamp, the steaming dishes smelled delicious, and in the center of the table, Alice's hands idly smoothed a tablecloth as she waited for her children. There was no resentment in her eyes, no visible scars, only the serenity of someone who had understood the value of forgiveness. When Chloe and Mark entered the dining room, they stood still for a moment, observing the scene with a mixture of nostalgia and gratitude. They couldn't remember the last time they shared a dinner with their mother not like this, not with the peace they now felt in their chests. Chloe was the first to move, approaching her mother with a trembling smile, and Mark followed, sitting beside her with an expression that, for the first time in years, wasn't loaded with guilt, but with genuine love. Alice watched them tenderly, and, in a soft but firm voice, told them she was proud of them, that she had seen their change, that she understood that redemption wasn't just a promise, but a path they had chosen to walk with their hearts. Chloe took her mother's hand, and with tears in her eyes, told her she would never let her feel alone again, that there wasn't a single day she didn't wish she had made a different decision in the past. Mark, his voice choking, added that everything they had done so far was for her, to show her they weren't the same people who once betrayed her. Alice smiled slightly and told them they didn't need to prove anything else to her, that the real change was seen in their actions, and that now, finally, they could call themselves a family again. The dinner passed with soft laughter and shared memories, with anecdotes that seemed lost in time, but now came back to life with the magic of reconciliation. They didn't need to talk about the past with pain. They didn't need to reopen wounds that had already healed. They allowed themselves to enjoy the present, the fact that they were there, together, that they had found their way back to each other. Alice looked at them both, her heart full of a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time, and in a serene voice told them that the real treasure was never the money, but the love that binds us. Chloe and Mark looked at her with moist eyes, feeling the weight of those words in the depths of their souls. They had pursued riches, they had believed success was measured in numbers, they had let ambition blind them, and in the end, everything that truly mattered was sitting across from them in the figure of their mother, in the lesson she had taught them with her life. When the night came to an end and the table was empty, Alice sat for a few more minutes, watching the dim light of the candles that still flickered. Her children had said goodbye with sincere hugs, with the promise to return soon, with the certainty that this time they wouldn't leave her life. She sighed peacefully, allowing herself to feel the weight of the day on her shoulders. And for the first time in many years, she didn't feel sadness or loneliness. She felt peace. She closed her eyes for a moment and remembered Robert's face, the voice of the man who rescued her from the abyss and taught her that there is always a second chance to live. She smiled gratefully, because she knew that wherever he was, he would be proud of her. And so, with the certainty that her story had not been in vain, she blew out the candles and went up to her room, her soul light, her heart complete. She had found her true purpose. She had recovered her family, and most importantly, she had shown that love is the only legacy that truly endures. Alice's story teaches us a bitter but profound lesson. The greatest wealth wasn't the fortune Robert left behind, but the ability to forgive even after the deepest betrayal. She lost everything, but in the end, she gained everything: a purpose in life and a family rebuilt from the ashes of betrayal. If you were in Alice's position, would you be brave enough to forgive and give Chloe and Mark a second chance? Or do you believe they didn't deserve it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single comment. Press the like button on this video if you believe in the power of repentance, and hit subscribe so you don't miss other meaningful life stories that will touch your heart. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video.